Hello and welcome to Critters and Cultures, the podcast where we explore the fascinating intersection of animal welfare and cultural diversity. I'm your host and veterinarian, Dr. Azalia Boyd, ready to uncover how our cultural differences influence, enhance, and sometimes challenge the way we care for animals and relate to each other. Join us on this journey through global traditions, learning from diverse perspectives, and advocating for empathy and respect in all of our interactions. Thank you so much for joining me on Critters and Cultures today. If something resonates with you during the podcast, please feel free to send me a direct message, comment below, or join the Critters and Cultures Circle. Today, I am thrilled to introduce a guest with an incredibly rich and diverse background. Dr. Katherine Fogelberg is a veterinarian, a world traveler, and a nonprofit founder. From being adopted into a white American family to founding a school in Kenya and working in South Africa, Katherine's journey is one of resilience, compassion, and dedication. Katherine, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, awesome. So is it okay if I call you Katherine, or do you prefer Dr. Fogelberg?
No, Katherine is just fine.
Okay, all right, we'll roll with Katherine today. Okay, Katherine, so before we jump in, I do want to ask you an icebreaker question, okay? Something that people can get to know you a little bit more intimately before we dive into the questions. So I'd love to ask you this. If you could have an animal as your lifelong companion with the ability to talk or share stories with you, which animal would it be? And what do you think they'd say about the Katherine we don't know yet?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. Well, the people who know me know I am a cat person through and through. So it would likely be one sort of large cat, whether that was a tiger, probably not a lion, I love lions, but a tiger or a cougar or something like that is probably what I would have. What would they say to me, or what would they tell other people about me?
What do you think they'd say about you?
About me?
Yeah.
I think they would tell people that I was very silly and that I came up with a lot of really stupid nicknames for them that they hated. And but that I always wished that I was a cat, and the best I could do was to have one as a companion for the rest of my life.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I love that. So nicknames like Kitty Kitty?
Well, we have 3 cats. We have 3, obviously household cats, and we are always coming up with really stupid names for them. So our youngest is a boy. He's a gray tabby. His name is Billy. But he is more often referred to as either Bill Bill or Billy Boo Bear. So yes, very silly names.
Very silly. Okay, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Okay, so let's get into you. You and I have had a conversation, but this is the first time the audience is listening and watching and getting to know you and your expertise. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. There were some stories that you shared with me that I thought were very deep and part of shaping who you are today. Can you share about your experiences as a child, who you are, where you come from, all of that?
Yeah, so I was actually born in South Korea and don't know where, was literally found wandering the streets when I was about a year old and was taken in by a passerby to a local orphanage where I stayed for about 2 weeks before I was passed on to a foster home. So I was in foster care for around 4 months, and then I was adopted by a white American couple and flew to Kansas City where they came to pick me up. Was raised in Colorado. My parents who adopted me did ultimately get divorced when I was about 4, and my mother had sole custody of me and my older brother, who was a biological son. So we did see my dad every other weekend. It was sort of I'm a 70s baby, so yes, I'm old. But that was sort of just the way things happened in that day and age. So I saw my dad every other weekend, but I grew up in a not particularly healthy household, and kind of knew I was kind of one of those kids. So from the time I was about in sixth grade, I was like, I really want to be a veterinarian based on a sort of a field trip I had taken to a local veterinary clinic. And I was a pretty good student, but the thing that always made me struggle was math. And so as I got older and expressed my desires to be a veterinarian, my mother was pretty consistent in her insistence that I was not smart enough to be a veterinarian because I wasn't good at math. So around the time that happened, I was also allowed to pick up an instrument, and so I learned how to play the flute, and actually ended up going to college the first time on a music scholarship, and was a professional scholarship in my first life, and did that, and went into the military and did that as a military musician for a while, and then ended up getting a scholarship and going back to school, and ultimately I did end up doing pre-veterinary studies, so got a bachelor's degree in animal science. But yeah, that was a little bit just the abbreviated version of my childhood.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. So, 70s, by the way, is not old. Okay, let's just go back to that point. So, growing up I'm going to dig into kind of just your cultural background. So, growing up as a Korean adoptee in a white American family, how did you become aware of your racial and cultural differences? Can you mark a first time that became apparent to you, or anything from your childhood that you remember that you felt maybe isolated or accepted, or what did that look like?
Yeah, so I felt very isolated actually in a lot of ways as a child. It was one of those things where, you grow up, well, at least I grew up in a situation where in the 70s, when children were adopted internationally, most of the time the parents didn't know a lot about the ethnic and cultural origins of their children. And so I was raised to be a white American, is essentially how I was raised. And so when I would look in the mirror, there was this really huge dissonance within me, because it was like, I thought I was a white American, and then I looked in the mirror and clearly I was not a white American, right? And so I actually grew up wanting to have red hair and green eyes so desperately, because I thought it was beautiful, but I also thought it would help me fit in more. I also have pretty significant scarring on both of my hands from burns that I acquired when I was a very young child, and that also set me apart. So not only did I look different, but I had these scars on my hands, and then I was also adopted. And people were kind of funny. They go, when did you figure out you were adopted? It's like, well, it's pretty obvious. It's not like my parents could hide that from me. And so there were this trifecta of things that made me feel very disconnected, I think, to a lot of people in my childhood. And to top it off, I'm fairly introverted. And so even as a child, it was just difficult for me to make friends and find a community that was really supportive. And I didn't have that support from home either, because as I said, my childhood wasn't particularly healthy. But what I did have was dogs and cats. And so even though I didn't expressly and overtly know that taking care of them, was a potential career choice from a very early age until I was in 6th grade, I had dogs and cats that accepted me for who I was and didn't laugh at me and didn't say mean things to me. I did have a really sweet, really stupid Irish setter growing up, and she ate everything. I mean, this dog ate everything. She ate cupcakes with the cupcake lining. She ate aluminum foil. She ate lit fireworks at one point. Never had a GI issue. And then I hated peanut butter and jelly when I was growing up. It was just the thing that I just didn't like. But we were poor, and so we had peanut butter and jelly a lot. So I was like, ooh, I'm just going to feed my peanut butter and jelly sandwich to the dog, right? And pretend like I had eaten. So, and this was, I think I must have been 6 years old. And so I gave it to my dog, Sally was her name. And she immediately threw up, and I was so mad. Like, dog, you ate cupcakes and chocolate and fireworks and threw up my peanut butter jelly sandwich.
Gosh, there's the evidence. You were supposed to keep it on the low. That was a secret.
Exactly. So, but yeah, so I had my Irish setter Sally, and then we actually had 4 cats, and then when my parents got divorced, we ended up with 2 cats. And so, yeah, they were kind of the bridge between me having some acceptance in my life and not having acceptance in my life. And so that was it was a huge challenge. And my mother was not around a lot, especially when after they had gotten divorced, because she had dropped out of college actually when she got married. So she went back to school, and obviously we were poor. She didn't have enough money to have a babysitter or to have childcare, and so we were the typical 80s latchkey kids, which meant when we came home from school, there was nobody there,
Right.
waiting for us. So yeah, it was different. And then when I started school, I was on free and reduced lunch because, again, we were very poor. And so there was yet another sort of stigmatized thing that I had to deal with when I was growing up. I did have a couple of really good friends when I was growing up. So I can't say that I didn't have any friends and, that nobody liked me. But I think I had a lot more challenges growing up than maybe your typical kid. Even your typical kid that was growing up in poverty.
Friends, dogs, and cats. That's all we need in life, right? That's
Yeah,
it. It's a few
agreed.
friends, a handful of friends, actually.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The older we get, I think we're like, we don't need 100 friends. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes people can be really disruptive.
Agreed.
But a handful of friends, cats and dogs. Now, was that something that the pets being in your home, Was that something that you were pushing for, or is that something that your parents just had?
That was just something that my parents had. So even when my parents were married, we were very poor, but we had cats, and then we had a dog, and that was a very constant thing throughout my childhood was having cats and dogs in the house, which
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, I feel like I hear a lot of those stories, and I'm sure you do too, being a veterinarian yourself and meeting clients, right? How important these pets are to the kids,
Yeah.
whatever challenges they're going through, mental health challenges, physical challenges, acceptance challenges. There's always love in the pet's heart for you, exactly as you are, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you ever feel a pull to explore your Korean heritage?
Not really. And I think part of that was because it was something I was ashamed of when I was growing up. Again, being raised by a white family, not that they instilled a sense of shame in me per se, but I think that because they didn't know how to be culturally, aware and teach me to be proud of that cultural heritage. It just was something that was another thing that made me different. And so that was not something I was particularly interested in. And then as I got older, I started sort of thinking about it. And then I went into the military. And unfortunately, there are a lot of GIs who go overseas to Korea for a year. And many of them are white men who come back with Korean women.
Right.
And I had multiple really, really negative experiences with those women when I was on military bases. And so it just sort of put a sour taste in my mouth, and sort of made me not wish to kind of go back and experience that. I have heard from a lot of people. I have several friends who are Korean adoptees as well, and other Koreans who have gone back and said that it's a beautiful country and that the people tend to be very, very welcoming to them. But as you know, those scars can run pretty deep, and so I'm not quite sure I'm ready to do that.
To do
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I understand. So there's a deep emotional complexity from what it sounds like in being raised in one culture while looking like you belong to another. How did that shape your understanding of where home was geographically, right? Did you
Yeah.
just feel like you belonged where you were? Did you,
No,
I guess as a child, right? You're saying that you've had these scars, but as a child, were you envisioning a place other than where you were?
that's a really good question. I don't know what I thought as a child. I think when you're younger, you just sort of absorb what home is to other people and assume that applies to you. And then as you get older, you start to question that. And so I think for me, this is actually the root of sort of all of the identity crises that I've ever had in my life, which is where is home for me, right? What is home? And as I've gotten older, I've been married now for 10 years to a wonderful man. And I think you start to realize, or at least I've started to realize, home isn't a place, it's a person, right? And so wherever my husband is where my home is. But geographically, I don't know that I am tethered to any particular place. But I will say that I am a very patriotic person. I do believe very strongly in what I was provided in the United States, even if it wasn't perfect or even close to being perfect. I know with a little bit of research that I've done into sort of Korean culture and the way that I might have been raised in Korea or looked at in Korea, that my opportunities here have been significantly increased and were far more boundless than they would have been if I had stayed in Korea. So, I am a proud American. When people ask me, what my heritage is, I'm an American. I mean, that's what I identify with. I happen to have been born in Korea, but I served my country. I'm proud of the fact that I served my country. I think that is sometimes difficult for people to reconcile because they don't see me as an American, even though I am as much an American as anybody else.
Yeah.
So,
I love that. I love that. Thanks for letting us know how you identify. And I'm thinking back to, stories that my parents told me. So I am first generation American. So my parents are from the Caribbean. And
oh
my
wow.
mom would tell me stories that, while she was driving when they first got here to this country, in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, that they would have to turn down their music, reggae music, because people would laugh
Yeah.
at the fact that they were listening to reggae, right?
Yeah.
And so now reggae is cool. Bob
Yeah.
Marley is cool. We see this going on with the statement former President Trump made about the Haitians, right? And it's always like
Mm.
there's always this culture of people that are going to get picked on
Yeah.
until it becomes cool,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I mean, I definitely can relate to that, especially from hearing stories from my own culture and my own heritage.
Yeah.
So you being American, identifying as American, but the world not necessarily always seeing you or accepting you as an American. What did the world see you as? I think you mentioned a term to me, model minority. What
Yeah.
was that? Tell me what that stereotype means.
So the model minority was actually created in, I want to say, the 60s. And it was basically, unfortunately, it was basically to say to other non-white people in the United States, and unfortunately particularly Black and African American individuals, that look, if you just work really hard and you assimilate into white culture, you can be really successful, because that's what Asians have done, right? And so it served several negative purposes, one of which was to drive a wedge between the Black and African American community and the Asian community, and to also provide sort of this idea that if you assimilated into the culture and you worked really hard and you just put your head down and you absorbed all of the negativity and the racism and the injustices, that you would still somehow in the United States manage to get ahead. And so that has persisted pretty strongly even through today, with this idea that, Asians are smart, they're hardworking, they are quiet, they're going to do pretty much everything that you ask them to do, and they're not going to complain about it. They're going to be very healthy emotionally and mentally and physically. And essentially, you can pretty much just treat them like doormats, and they're still going to be really, really good at what they do and help your company, achieve what you want to achieve.
Wow.
And while, as a child, I wasn't familiar with the term model minority, I don't think I became familiar with that until I was into my adulthood. I certainly suffered from it, because as the only Asian girl and Asian person in my elementary school, middle school, junior high school, and then when I got into high school, there were like 3 other Asians out of 900 in the high school. I was a good student and I worked hard and I was successful. And so I sort of played into that idea, but it was also what, from a very young age, imposed upon me that imposter syndrome, right? Like, because there were these impossibly high expectations and standards of me. And I think to some extent that's where my mother was coming from when she told me I wasn't smart. And she was like sort of disappointed in the fact that I wasn't good at math, because all Asians are good at math, And so, yeah, it pushed me really hard, but it also caused me a lot of stress and anxiety that I wasn't going to meet the expectations that had been placed upon me.
Like, that is a stereotype that affected the way you viewed your own achievements growing
Yeah.
up, right? So if
Yeah.
how did it affect were you proud of yourself and the things that you could? How did you navigate
No.
those pressures?
Yeah, no, I was never proud of myself, and I don't think that was all because of the model minority, but I do think that had something to do with it in the way that my mother, in particular, treated me. So I remember multiple times bringing home straight A report cards, and my mother just like throwing the report card on the table and going, "Well, that's boring. Can't you do something different?" Right? And which is weird. I mean, that's not normal, I don't think. And now that I have some perspective on it. But, things like trying out for the cheerleading squad. I was a gymnast for quite some time as a young kid, and, pretty much self-taught, because again, we were poor and I didn't get lessons, but I was a decent gymnast. And so that really helped me when I tried out for cheerleading, which was sort of like my one thing to try to fit in, and I made the cheerleading squad, and I had been ranked like the number one, tryout, and I was really excited about it. And, when I got home, told my mom, she was like, "Oh, I was so afraid you were going to grow up to be a geek. I'm so glad you got into the cheerleading squad." And, just
Wow.
things like that. And I think part of that was my mother's personality, but I also think it was this idea that like she had adopted a Korean child that
Gosh.
for some reason needed to be perfect in a lot of ways and just wasn't living up to that standard.
So you, as a veterinarian, you obviously made it, and you have tons of accomplishments, okay, that I cannot wait to dive into a little bit more. But speaking specifically as a veterinarian, where you're dealing with clients from diverse backgrounds all of the time, do you feel that your experience with how you grew up, this model minority label, do you think that that has influenced your approach to dealing with clients or your colleagues or advocacy work at all?
Yes and no. I think for a long time I was either unwilling or unable to admit that what I looked like had such an influence on my life, because I think, you always, at least for me, I was always looking for that acceptance, right? And what I looked like was the reason that I wasn't accepted. And so I wanted to find ways that I could be accepted. And I think that's partly where that achievement-oriented mindset for me came from. And so I think I have a very sort of set idea about what it takes to be successful and the type of personality that it takes to be successful. And so as an instructor in the college classroom, for example, the first couple of years were really hard for me because, I was really hard on my students, and I continue to be hard on my students, but in a little bit gentler way now, because I think that I've learned that just because this is the way I have been successful doesn't necessarily mean that's the way everybody has to be successful. And it took me a while to accept that there was a different way to be successful. So I guess that's my way of saying that even though a lot of us live in this space of being minoritized or underserved or marginalized, we still have our blind sides, like our blind spots, and we have to be really aware of those. And I think more than anything, working in academia, in particular, working with the disabled community, the people who have disabilities, has been really helpful and eye-opening to me, because I think I had ideas about another marginalized group that I never really thought about that much because I had never experienced that, right? So that was the privilege that I've had, is that I have scars on my hands, and so I got made fun of for that, but I didn't really have a noticeable disability. And so I think that for me, that was a real blind spot. And so being able to then finally, probably later in my 30s and early 40s, realize, I have had some privilege, and there are some things that I have to own, even though there are things that I have had to struggle with. I've also had some things that I've had some privilege. And so I have to sort of sit back and take some stock of that, and then look at my colleagues who are people with disabilities, whether that's a physical disability, a neurodiversity, or something like that, or somebody who's a member of the LGBTQIA community that has different, issues that they have to deal with. I have to step back and say, okay, well, what advantages have I had? What privileges have I had that these individuals have not? And figure out a way to really work with that. So I think in that sense, it's helped me become more self-aware and more, I think, empathetic to individuals who are in other underserved communities, and try to really step in and learn about that. But I still struggle with being part of a marginalized community, and struggle with how I use that platform in the most positive way to influence change without pushing people too far, but also making sure that they're just uncomfortable enough to acknowledge that they also have privileges that maybe they haven't really thought about in those ways.
Yeah, 100%. And I think part of that is coming on this podcast, right? And teaching people essentially through your experience, and acknowledging how you became self-aware, and acknowledging what benefits it was for you to finally become self-aware, and how that helped you navigate and is continuing to help you navigate the world, right? In your body of who you are, and accepting that privilege. You spoke about you as a professor. I don't know if I'd want you as a professor, by the way. It might be really hard, but you said that it took discipline. You said that it takes strength, and you mentioned a few things that students need to be able to be successful, right? I want to highlight that because you did the Comrades Marathon. Am I pronouncing it correctly? The Comrades
That's right.
Marathon?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, let's just take a moment, because that is regarded as like the toughest and most prestigious, I think, long distance race in the world, right? What does it cover? How many miles?
It depends on the year. So there's up years and down years, and I've only done down years. So in down years, it's about 56 miles.
Okay, 56 miles. That's a down year?
That's a down year, yeah.
And so the up years are higher than that?
No, they're a little bit lower, because the cutoff is 12 hours, so they give you a little bit. Yeah.
Got you. So you did one of the highest long distance miles.
Yeah, so I did
56
two
miles.
downs.
Yeah, and so that's about, for our kilometer people, that's about 90 kilometers, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And that race, it symbolizes endurance, it symbolizes perseverance, it symbolizes camaraderie, and runners from all over the world participate in that, right? It's a test of physical and mental limits. Did you feel a need to test your physical and mental? Is this something, what encouraged you to do this race?
Hanging out with the wrong people.
It is a significant achievement, right? It is a significant achievement. I would think, what parallels can you draw between that physical and mental challenge and some of the emotional or professional challenges that you faced over the years? Like, what can I learn from you going through that? Because I will not participate in the race. But
that's okay.
Teach me something that you learned from going through that experience.
I mean, it's a little bit trite, but I think it's just this idea that pain doesn't kill you. It really does make you stronger, right? And your ability to absorb that pain and figure out a way to manage it in a positive way is really what's going to get you where you're going to go. So my husband and I met after I had run Comrades. I'd been married before, but I had run Comrades before we met. And I continued to do marathons and ultra marathons throughout the first many years that we were married. And in fact, I'm training for one right now. And one of the things that he has consistently told me is that in the races where you keep a positive attitude, you finish and you're happy and you're so much better off. In the races where you get into that downward negative spiral, you're either not going to finish or you're going to be really angry at the end. And that's true, right? And so I think it's less about the physical for me at this point. Like physically, I'm a little beaten up, but I know I can do it. It's just making me get to the point where mentally I'm like, okay, this is going to be hard. I know it's going to be hard. I've done hard things before. It's temporary. I just need to get through it because I know when I get to the end, I'm going to be so happy that I did it. And then I can go brag about the fact that I did it, right? It's bragging rights. And I think that's what sometimes students just need to hear is that it's, and I'm also fond of telling people, I mean, both of my graduate degrees are in education. It's really what I'm passionate about. And I think, and we can probably talk about this at some other time, or we could do a whole nother session about it. But lately it seems to me like we're more interested in higher education and giving students what they want than giving students what they need. And those two things are not the same thing all the time. Sometimes they do align. Sometimes what they want and what they need are the same. Sometimes what they want and what they need are actually considerably far apart. And if we always give them what they want, we can't prepare them to be successful when they go out into the real world. Because part of being successful is getting the things you need, even if they're hard things, right? And so that's where I think the long distance running, it's the discipline of getting up and going out for a 20-mile run at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday when you'd rather just sleep in, eat ice cream and watch TV, and spend time with your cats or your husband or your kids or whatever is, makes you happy in your life. It's knowing that you have a goal that you're working toward that will be worth it. And that even if you don't necessarily meet the goal the way you wanted to, that you can look back and be proud of the process that you went through. And I think that's really where it comes down to, right? I mean, it's clinical practice for a reason because nobody's ever perfect at it. You have to continue practicing or you're never going to be successful. And I think sometimes our students forget that just because they're called doctor doesn't mean they know everything or that it's possible for them to know everything. And it's the journey that's really the most important part of all that.
I absolutely love that. And where do you teach right now? Where are you a professor?
I'm actually not teaching currently. I'm a professional mentor, which is pretty awesome.
Okay.
But I taught public health for 8 years, and then I was in administration and taught in veterinary medicine for 4 years before I moved into the role I'm in now.
Okay. And then with that, one of your other major accomplishments is you are a co-founder of a nonprofit school in Kenya.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. What motivated you to start that project? Why Kenya? Why Kenya?
Well, yeah. So, as you mentioned, I ran Comrades Marathon, which is in South Africa, and I actually visited that country for the first time in 2005 and pretty much fell in love almost instantaneously with the country and the continent. And then in 2016, I was teaching public health and I volunteered with Veterinarians Without Borders and took 3 of my public health students to do their practice experiences in Uganda. So we were able to spend 30 days in Uganda working within the local villages there and getting a different experience. And that was around the same time when sort of the political, winds started to significantly change in the United States. And it was tough for me because, regardless of how I feel personally about Donald Trump, his policies were threatening to me in a lot of ways as a woman of color, even as a former military member, as a veteran, there were lots of things that I struggled with. And I just was in a really low place. And I had graduated with my PhD in 2014, and I had a couple of really good friends that had just graduated from a similar program at the same institution, and we were still doing some research together. And so during one of our research meetings, I had just kind of been out on a run, and it was like, I need to do something good in the world, right? Like, I just feel like I need to do something that makes me feel like it's worthwhile to be going through what we're going through. Yeah. And I had several friends who had talked about opening schools within the United States, and I was like, they need education, in sub-Saharan Africa. So why not? So I walked in, I was like, hey, I want to open a school in Africa. Who's with me? And they were like, I'm in. And so, yeah. So we started having a conversation. We connected with another one of our colleagues who was part of that program who had done significant work in Kenya and had some connections there. And I actually had a friend that I had met in 2005 who was also Kenyan. And so I'd always thought, oh, it'd be fun to go visit Isaac in Kenya. So that's kind of how that happened. It was just sort of fortuitous. And Kenya ended up being a really great place for us to start because there is still a lot of work to be done, but they're a little bit more progressive in the way they view education and universal elementary education than some of their neighbors in the area. So yeah, that's pretty much how that started, and we're still going strong.
Tell us your school. Tell us about the school. What's the name of the school? Who do you guys educate? Who do you empower?
Yeah, so our school is called Misomi Academy, and it's in Kisii, Kenya, which is sort of central western Kenya. And we have about a little over 300 students right now. They're around 4 to about 14 years old. And so it's a primary school, and primary school in Kenya is what we would consider sort of preschool all the way up through 8th grade. And so, yeah, we go over there every year. We have conversations with their teaching team, their parents, and the students, and they're really working right now to get a science laboratory set up because the curriculum has changed, the national curriculum has changed. And so we provide a lot of financial support for them, but we also just provide sort of emotional support and opportunities for them to learn and for us to learn from them. One of the things that's really important to our organization, which is Misomi Academy for Girls, is that we do not want to go into Kenya and tell them how to do things better or teach them how to be Americans. We want to maintain the integrity of the Kenyan system. They do amazing work with what they have. We just want to figure out ways to augment and support them in doing the best that they can with what they've got. And if that means providing them money so that they can purchase things for their classrooms or technology or paint the walls, which are beautiful, or add an addition onto their school, then that's what we will do because they are incredible at what they do, and I just don't think it's our place to go in and tell them that they're not doing a good job because we Americans know better, because we don't. So.
Yeah, I think we see the same thing and kind of pulling it back to veterinary practice as we're both veterinarians, right? It's like, how do we go in and share with the client that's from a diverse background how they should care for their pets, right?
Right.
I had a situation where I had a client, he was Asian descent. I wasn't 100% sure from where, but he didn't want to euthanize his dog. And we went back and forth, and he came in for pain medications. He wanted to make sure the dog was super comfortable. And you know how it can be. Veterinary medicine can have kind of a culture within clinics, right? Everyone from the receptionist all the way kind of through the other vets that might have passed him by, or the technicians were always, slamming doors or telling me, this is wrong, you should tell this man to euthanize. And it wasn't until his dog passed at home, he came back and he thanked me personally. He said, thank you so much. Of course I asked him about euthanasia, but after a while it's like, I saw that this man was not having that. So how could I help him keep his dog the most comfortable? And he came back and thanked me and said that his dog had died at home, and that if I had euthanized, or if he had chosen to euthanize his dog, the spirit of that dog would have gotten trapped, right? Between what I envisioned as like heaven and hell, how he explained it to me, that the spirit would be trapped. And so, I see that, drawing kind of a parallel. I can't come in to an exam room and just tell people this is the way it should be done. I have to listen, right? And in that experience, you mentioned that you're learning so much from these kids, from these girls.
Yeah.
And how much I have learned from my clients as well, just from different backgrounds, right? So yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that you're not trying to make them American. You're giving, I guess, in a way, a voice to the voiceless. You're amplifying what they're already doing because you believe that they're already doing an amazing job. They're already intellectual, right? They just need support, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that's a beautiful thing. How has that, because you have international experiences. You mentioned South Africa, you mentioned Kenya, which I love, and I will be finding you to find out when in 2025 you guys are going, because I can build a science lab. I'm pretty sure that I can build a science lab. But these international experiences really, I'm sure, have given you a broader perspective when you're dealing with clients. I know you're not 100% practicing right now, but could you share an example of how this cultural awareness has helped you connect with clients on a deeper level?
Yeah, I mean, I love that story that you just told because I think it is, we sort of feel like we know best, but we don't always know best and we have to take that step back. So yeah, I mean, when you and I were talking, I think I told you the story about I had a couple come into my exam room at one point, and they were there for their dog, and I don't even remember what they had brought their dog in, but the wife was the one who had primarily talked, and her husband just sort of, they were an older couple, and he was kind of just sitting there, and he didn't seem particularly interested in engaging in the conversation, which, I mean, that sometimes happens. But his wife clearly had an accent, and it was one of those accents where I listened to it really closely because my first instinct was like, is that British? Is that Australian? And then I just listened a little longer. It's like, oh my gosh, that's a South African accent. And I haven't heard that in so long. And for people who are familiar with the South African accent, it is very often mistaken for British or Australian. And it's frustrating to South Africans. And it's a beautiful accent. I mean, it's one of my favorite in the whole wide world. And so his wife had talked to me quite a bit, and there was a break in the conversation. And I just kind of cocked my head and I looked at her and I was like, is that a South African accent I detect? And his face just lit up like the sun. I mean, he was so excited, and I almost could not get him to stop talking after that, which was fine, right? Like he's like, so many people just automatically assume that I'm British or I'm Australian. It's so frustrating. How did you know it was, South African? And so we just had this really great conversation, and I was able to, tell him, that it was one of my favorite accents. I had spent time in South Africa. We talked about comrades, and I was able to get him to engage with the appointment in a way that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise get him to engage. And I think to some people, and I think I even said this to some people, that seems like it might be a really small thing. But when I think back on it, it was probably a big deal for him, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people recognize that. And just to see the amount of enthusiasm that he came into that appointment with after I acknowledged that and recognized it, it was a whole different person. It was really amazing. It's kind of like, I think if somebody comes up to me and recognizes that I'm Korean, it's like a very different experience than somebody who comes up to me and immediately assumes I'm Chinese.
Right.
It's meaningful.
That is huge, because immediately you have developed this trust with this client, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't know if you're doing good medicine or not anymore. And he's just excited that you recognized him, right? And you saw him for not being British. They say that when there's the quote, and I'm going to botch this all the way up, but they say when you speak to a man in their language, you speak to their heart, right? Yeah. And it's almost like when you speak to someone, right, in their language, their native tongue, all of a sudden there's this relationship. There's this immediate tug on that person's heart. You're relatable. They feel like you understand them. There's all these connections, right? So even when only language, unfortunately, that I'm gonna put in air quotes, no, is a little bit of Spanish, okay? Mm-hmm. But I do try to use it when I'm in the exam room, and I always feel that same little joy. I feel the joy from the client when I relate to them in that manner. So that is a beautiful story. And it just goes to show, even if you're not a diverse, I feel like there's diversity in everything, right? I don't like to think or put out there that if you're a white American, you're not diverse. That is not the case, right? So there's diversity in all of us. But I do think that sometimes we get so stuck in who we are that we don't necessarily explore or even try to learn more about other people, other cultures, right? Mm-hmm. And just that small little experience, which I don't think is small at all, but that small, acknowledgement of his accent and him being seen kind of bridged the two of you together. And when you do that, that means, listen, whatever your recommendations are, more likely, whatever your estimates are, you're going to have a lot less problems. So I'm in such awe of all of your accomplishments. I love the messages that you have shared with us, and truly appreciate your perspective on a lot of this. So kudos to you for what you're doing. Kudos to you for connecting with your clients in that way and also giving us an idea on how we can, right? How we can do the same thing. So let's go ahead and close. I mean, I do have maybe one or two more questions for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So with that being said, we just talked about this cultural awareness and just having knowledge and the desire to learn. What do you think is the greatest misconception that people have about cultural awareness in veterinary medicine? How can the industry move towards a more inclusive and understanding approach?
That is a good question. I don't know that I know the specific answer to that, but from my perspective, I think there is a heavy investment on diversity equating to racial and ethnic diversity. And that is important. It is so important. But there are so many other types of diverse populations out there, right? And we've touched on a few of those. Persons with disabilities, whether that's physical, emotional, or mental. We've talked about the LGBTQIA community. But, there are first-generation college students. There are students from rural areas. There are low socioeconomic status students. There are students who, maybe they're foreign born and they're, first generation born in the United States, or they're, immigrants to the United States. Right. There's religious diversity. And so I think that for me, it is recognizing, as you said, that everybody has a diverse background in some form or fashion, and taking the time to reflect on something that I touched on earlier, which is, okay, so I have diversity, but that also gives me blind spots to other types of diversity, and being willing to sit down and be self-aware of what those are, and then figure out how you're going to engage those individuals and make sure that you include them as well. And I think just having conversations like this, right? Like talking to people and helping people understand that diversity is what makes the world beautiful. I mean, imagine how boring our world would be if everybody looked the same and everybody did the same thing and talked the same way and ate the same food. Yeah. And then think about when you're building programs where you're trying to attract diverse individuals, how you can support those individuals. I think for me, coming from academia, one of the biggest frustrations I had was this idea that, well, if we want to build diversity, we have to lower our standards. And or it was the opposite of, well, we're going to let students in, but they're probably less prepared. And oftentimes, unfortunately, this was in reference to students who came from like historically black colleges and universities, right? Well, they obviously didn't get as good an education because they went to HBCU. And it's like, well, first of all, where did that come from? And second of all, if they met our minimum standards and they got in, then they're clearly qualified to be here. The question is not whether they're qualified. The question is, how are we supporting them once they're here? When I went to vet school, I went to Texas A&M, and there were 4 Asians in my class, a handful of Hispanic men and women, and there were 3 African American, 2 female and 1 male. And the 2 females and I were friends, and neither one of them finished the program. And when I had conversations with them, I kind of knew this, but it was really overt. What struck me the most was they said, I just didn't have any support. I didn't have anyone that understood sort of socially what I was going through and could support me. And so that's one of my big things. It's like, yeah, it's great if you have a diverse class, but they're not going to make it if you don't support them. And it's not because they're not smart. And it's not because they're lazy, and it's not because they don't want to work hard or they're underprepared. It's because they don't know where they can get their hair done the way they like to get it done. They can get the kind of foods that they like to eat. They can worship the way they want to worship, and they have a community. And it doesn't matter what kind of community. It could be a community of people with disabilities. It could be a church community. It could be any community. And if we're not supporting them that way, then no, they're not going to make it, because whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you still need social support, and you still need people who understand what you're going through and can help you through that time. So I think that's what I would say is we first have to look at ourselves and say, what are we doing to support our communities, and how are we going to build that? And then when we do have that, once they get here, then we can help them be successful just like everybody else.
Yeah. And unfortunately for those students that you said that mentioned that they were your friends didn't make it, so many of the students coming up now, you said 70s and I'm an 80s babies, but now they're building their own communities, which is also beautiful, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing that, they're building their own groups, right? But I 100% understand that universities and other social structures or institutions rather need to support those efforts as well. Looking back at the different stages of your life, your childhood, your veterinary career, your travels, your nonprofit work, what advice would you give to someone who is struggling to find their own path or cultural identity?
You know, I think for me, at some point in my life, I just had to realize that I had to embrace who I was and just be who I was, right? Which sounds really weird, but I think if we try to force ourselves to conform with the world, that we're always going to be unhappy, because no matter what you do, there's always going to be somebody who tells you you're doing it wrong, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, it's figuring out what your passion is, going with your gut, and being willing to try something new when it comes along. You know, I never wanted to go into clinical practice when I graduated vet school, to be quite honest with you, and I had to do it because I financially didn't really have any other way of being successful. And as much as I really disliked being in clinical practice, it has helped me in so many immeasurable ways.
Yeah.
I never thought I was going to be an academician. I never thought I was going to end up, teaching and doing all the things that I've done. And that's ultimately where I found home, is in education and being around other people who are passionate about education. So I'm not saying say yes to everything, but I am saying sit and think about it before reflexively saying no when somebody provides you an opportunity that you're like, oh, that's kind of outside my comfort zone. Because it's when we get outside our comfort zones that we grow and that we mature and we kind of figure out who we are. So embrace who you are. I'm a weird person. I know that, but you know what? I embrace it because it makes me unique and it makes me special. And so that, I think that's the most important thing, is figuring out how to accept who you are and being okay with that.
Yeah.
It's the most important thing to me.
And we all have a little bit of weird. I really think that I'm weird too. So, I mean,
We're veterinarians. We have to be a little weird.
a little weird, right? Anything else that you want to share with the listeners and the audience today?
I don't think so. I appreciate you having me on. It's been really fun having a conversation with you, and I'm excited to listen to the podcast and hear some of the other guests that you have on, and I love
Absolutely.
what you're doing, so it's pretty
Absolutely.
cool.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Katherine Fogelberg. It has been absolutely a pleasure having you on the show as well. Your journey is truly inspiring, and I'm sure all of the listeners will take away valuable insights from your experiences. And for those who want to learn more about your work or get involved in your initiatives, where can they find you?
So they can find me at LinkedIn under my name, or if they want to learn more about Misomi Academy, they can go to misomiacademy.org, and that's MSOMI academy.org. Just in case people were curious, Misomi actually means scholar or learned one in Swahili, so that's why we chose that name. You can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or through Misomi Academy, so would love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you for joining us on Critters and Cultures, where we explore the deep connections between humans, animals, and the world around us. Remember, every person has a story, every creature has a story, and every culture has its wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep discovering the wonders of our shared world.